Senator Perdue, then Senator White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your leadership and perseverance in this budget process. I'd also like to commend the committee staff for bringing this budget resolution in on time and for their tireless efforts. You know, being new to the Senate, I have an outside perspective still that allows me to see our current financial situation the way every working family in America sees it. Back home in Georgia, people are outraged. I'm outraged by the financial irresponsibility of Washington. But there are no innocent players up here in this drama. My take is very simple. We're in the midst of a full-blown financial crisis of our own making. It's real, it's serious, and it's happening right now. Today in this crisis, we've reached a financial tipping point in 3 critical areas. First, today we have over $18 trillion of debt. If interest rates were to rise to their 30-year average of just over 5.5%, we'd be paying almost $1 trillion in interest alone today. That's just not possible. In 2016 alone, interest expense increases by $50 billion. Imagine in 1 year what we could do to support troops and pay down our debt with that money. But the problem gets worse. While current annual budget deficits are down a bit, they're projected to turn around and rise again in the next few years. In the President's own budget, debt is projected to rise to $26 trillion by 2025. As a business guy, I look at this level and say this level of debt is just totally unsustainable. The second tipping point relates to our future unfunded liabilities, estimated in excess of $100 trillion. To put that in perspective, this liability combined with our current debt amounts to over $1 million per household. The final tipping point involves the Social Security Trust Fund, which is not within the scope of this Budget Committee today. A few weeks ago, the head of Social Security Administration testified before this committee that the retirement portion of Social Security would be exhausted, not insolvent, but exhausted by 2034. And Social Security disability would not be able to meet its obligations as early as 2017. Even if we borrow from the retirement side and move funds to the disability side, both will be exhausted by 2033, and this administration has no plan for those people who need it past 2033. This is what drives my constituents back home in Georgia absolutely crazy. As bad as it is, the worst is yet to come. Over the next 20 years, demands on the trust fund driven by baby boom retirees will cause these costs to rise dramatically. Without changes in Medicare trust fund, it will also be exhausted by 2030. Over the next year, we've got to work together to save Social Security and Medicare and ensure our current seniors and those who need help the most in these safety net programs. They're the most at risk here by our fiscal irresponsibility. For too long, Washington's dysfunction has created gridlock. One side wants tax increases, the other side wants spending cuts. In my experience, neither one will solve the equation in its entirety. We can't tax our way out of this mess, and we sure can't cut our way out of it alone. To break the gridlock and start solving the debt crisis, we simply have to get our economy growing again. 1 point of GDP growth means over $3 trillion in federal tax revenues over the next 10 years. The challenge to growing our economy, however, Mr. Chairman, is the fact that current economic policies of the past 6 years have failed working families who have seen their incomes decline dramatically. We have fewer people working as a percentage of the workforce than any time since 1978. In addition, the past 6 years alone, we've allowed 4 million women to fall into poverty under these policies. Almost 2/3 of small businesses have stopped hiring or have cut back employment because of the Affordable Care Act. Most new jobs being created today are part-time jobs, and the 30-hour rule of the Affordable Care Act is devastating many working families. In the midst of all that, we now see the Obama administration again turn its back on working Americans by vetoing the Keystone Pipeline, simply put, a jobs bill. Exacerbating the problem is the fact that we have more than $2 trillion trapped overseas because of our archaic repatriation tax code. If we could get Washington out of the way, imagine this capital roaring back into our economy, creating jobs and spurring incredible economic growth. In addition, comprehensive tax reform, which we've talked about today on both sides, is needed, along with reducing abusive regulations and unleashing our energy potential here in North America. Doing those 3 things alone could jumpstart this economy in a way that we haven't seen for decades. This current budget resolution calls for a balanced budget within 10 years, but that's just the first step, in my opinion. Over the next year, this committee has to commit to work every day to find a way to grow this economy, allowing us to balance our budget sooner. Merely balance our budget is not good enough, however. We need to develop a long-term plan to develop a surplus budget so we can begin to pay this debt down eventually to some more reasonable level over the long term. To avoid financial calamity, it's time we work in a nonpartisan way to break this gridlock. With a crisis of this magnitude, there are no innocent parties here in Washington. Both sides are guilty, even today. This is really about our commitment to fulfill our oath of office, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, Mr. Chairman, by solving this financial crisis right now. We just simply have to work together on this budget resolution, both sides, and then commit to developing a surplus plan over the long term to pay down this debt, to save Social Security, to provide for Medicare in the long term, and make sure these safety net programs that we all want are indeed solvent and can be sustained indefinitely. Winston Churchill said, Mr. Chairman, Americans always do the right thing after having tried everything else. Well, it's high time for us to do the right thing, both sides, right now. God knows we've tried everything else. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.